Okay, so what we're going to do today is start talking about Western Europe during the so-called Dark Ages. Now, I'm sure all of you have heard of this phrase before, the Dark Ages. We in history are actually starting to get away from that because the Dark Ages, first of all, they have negative connotations that somehow Western Europe during this period of time is this period of anarchy, like a kind of a Mad Max scenario where it's just roaming bands of people running around eating each other, and that's not it at all. Now, historians did use this term to describe the lack of intellectual work that came out of this period in time. In other words, you don't see the works of philosophy and theology, or at least this was the thought at the time, that you really don't see a lot of intellectual production coming out of Western Europe at the time. But in recent years, we kind of reevaluated that and kind of and came to the conclusion that yes, indeed, that Western Europe was producing, now again nowhere near as much as during the Roman period, but nevertheless, this is it was not a period of ignorance, certainly to any extent. So again, we're kind of getting away from this kind of period in time where we kind of divide. And we, instead of using the term dark age, we now refer to as the early medieval period, which is between, let's say, for example, 500 and let's say 1000 CE. That's usually the kind of the arbitrary time frame that we put on this. Now, so in order, obviously we're kind of picking up here as soon as the Roman, at least the Western Roman Empire collapses. Remember, in 476 CE, the last Roman emperor, the 16-year-old Romulus Augustulus, is overthrown by the local Germanic warlord, and you pretty much have the Western Roman Empire come to a close. Now, after the collapse of the Roman Empire, the Western one, I should say, you essentially have uh, you essentially have the Western have kind of fracturing into various Germanic kingdoms. If you see here on the map on the left-hand side, you see the everything from the Visigoths to the Ostrogoths to the Franks to the Burgundians to the Saxons, etc., etc. So you have all these different Germanic tribes just basically claiming parts of the old Roman Empire for themselves. Now, you have to understand that by this time, a significant, not a lot, not all, but a significant amount of the Germanic tribes have already converted to Christianity. However, it is not the Latin. Now, there is a theological battle being fought here between those who support the Latin Christianity, the interpretation of Christianity is coming out of Rome, headed by the Bishop of Rome, aka the Pope, and also that of Arian Christianity. Now, Arian Christianity is a particular type of mindset or a particular type of philosophy within Christianity that differs from that of Latin Christianity. In other words, it's called Arian Christianity because it's named after the bishop in the second century that began kind of promoting this idea that this version of Christianity. Now, there's a couple of differences here and there, but the one thing I want you to remember, the thing that I will probably end up testing you on, is the big difference between Latin and Arian Christianity. Now, the big difference between these two particular faiths is that of the idea of, no. The word Arian is referring to the concept of, remember, the word Aryan comes from the particular word that you're referring to, which the Nazis kind of ripped off, comes from what the Vedic peoples call themselves in India. Right? This is something different. This is Aryanism. All right, so there's a slight difference. Now, the big difference between Latin Christianity and Arian Christianity is that Latin is in the interpretation of what God is. Now, what I mean by this is that if in modern Christianity, for the most part, in mainstream modern Christianity, God is actually three parts: the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit / Holy Ghost, depending on your interpretation of that particular concept. So you have this Holy Trinity as it's known. Now, Arian Christianity does not have that. Arian Christianity believes in the unity of God. In other words, there is a Father and Jesus is his Son, but they're two distinct entities. All right. Remember, contrast that to Latin Christianity, which believes that you have these three separate beings, the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, but technically they're one. In Arian Christianity, there is no Trinity. It is the Father, God, and the Son, Jesus, and they are two separate individuals. Remember, keep in mind that this doesn't seem that big of a deal, but in reality, it really is. Remember, and these are not the only two interpretations of what Jesus and God is. Remember, you have Christians who believe that Jesus was, human, but his brain was divine. You have those who believe that Jesus was human up until his baptism by John the Baptist and then became divine. You have all these various different interpretations. These two, however, are probably the most dominant. And keep in mind that at one point in time, Arian Christianity had more followers than Latin Christianity. So let's talk about why that changes. How is it that Latin Christianity eventually becomes not only the dominant belief system within Western Europe, but quite frankly, the only one? And it starts with Clovis. Now, as I mentioned before, one of the kingdoms that that was kind of set up after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire was that of the Franks. Franks, the Franks are located here in what is now northern France, and you haven't guessed already. Yes, the word France comes from this particular Germanic tribe, the Franks. So the Franks have probably set up the most stable and most powerful of these Germanic kingdoms after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. Right? And they're led by a particular dynasty known as the Merovingians. Now, let me ask a question. Has anyone here ever heard of this word, the Merovingian, or the Merovingians? So the Merovingians have a particularly, let's say, profound kind of legacy in history. Now, I'm sure all of you have at least heard of or seen what is that movie called? It's based off a novel, and it was very controversial when it came out. It's yeah. So the Merovingian dynasty is the dynasty that rules this kingdom of the Franks. Jonathan, which one is it? It's about the Mona Lisa and there's this mystery about it. The Da Vinci Code. Yes, thank you. The Da Vinci Code. Kind of the premise of this novel is kind of based on the idea of the Merovingians. Now, the Merovingians, the dynasty claimed to be the descendants of Christ. Now, the whole process, how this works, according to them, is that you essentially have Mary Magdalene being actually the partner of Christ. And she's pregnant at the time that Jesus is arrested and crucified. She eventually escapes Judea and travels to the southern part of France, where she eventually has a daughter, Sarah. And this is the bloodline of Jesus, which eventually becomes the Merovingians. Now, there is absolutely no evidence of this ever happening. Okay, and rulers claiming to be descended from holy figures is not anything new. If you remember, Xerxes in Persia claimed to be the descendant of Ahura Mazda. In other words, he claimed to be the son of God. If you remember in Ethiopia, we were talking about the Christian kingdom in Ethiopia. They claim to house the Ark of the Covenant, and also they claim to be descendant from King Solomon of ancient Israel. So dynasties and monarchs in general claiming to be descendants of holy religious figures, it's just a way to solidify their own reputation and their own prestige, because again, it sounds cool. But again, just keep in mind that it's just an interesting thing. Now, I don't mean to sidetrack, but I do get this question every so often. Obviously, for those of you who've never seen the movie, the Da Vinci Code, is that still a movie? Has anyone seen this movie, by the way? Or read the book, I should say? Well, I'm gonna spoil the book and the movie for you. So if you haven't seen it already, I'm sorry. This is gonna be like the apocalypse all over again. But again, the whole novel slash movie is based on the idea that this idea that Mary Magdalene was the partner of Jesus. Eventually, was pregnant. Eventually, fled to southern France, and the descendants of Jesus still live today. And so I guess so I remember when the movie came out, it was incredibly controversial. I remember going to mass with my grandmother, and the priest there warning us, particularly those of us who were young, not to go to watch the movie. Which, of course, next thing I did was go watch the movie because I'm a rebel like that, clearly. Um, but I will say this is that. I get questions every once in a while about, was actually Jesus married? The whole premise of this is that Jesus and Mary Magdalene were married. And now, first of all, there's absolutely no evidence of this ever happening. There's no evidence that Jesus was married to Mary Magdalene, but at the same time, I will point out that there's no evidence that Mary Magdalene was a prostitute. Now, if you know anything about Mary Magdalene within the New Testament, there's a belief that Mary Magdalene was somehow a prostitute. That mentality actually came out in the around the 900 or the 8 or 900s of this current era. All right, but again, I will say this is that she seems to, from the bits and pieces of the mentions of her that still remain in the Gospels today, it does seem that Mary Magdalene was far more important than just being some person that used to hang out with him. Because according to, if I remember correctly, the book of Matthew, Matthew, in the Gospel according to Matthew, the first person that Jesus goes to when he resurrects when Jesus rises from the dead, he sees Mary Magdalene first, which is pretty interesting. But nevertheless, just kind of I've always found that kind of part of history kind of fascinating. So, but nevertheless, this, regardless of Merovingian's relation or whatever, at the time in 41, Clovis becomes king, and eventually he begins flirting with the idea of converting to Christianity. And at the time, Clovis is still considered a pagan. But eventually he decides to convert. So you begin to see both Arian bishops and Latin bishops both kind of courting Clovis, hoping to kind of bring him to their side. Now, eventually he he decides to convert to Christianity, or Latin Christianity, I should say, mostly because of let's say, the influence of his wife. His wife at the time was devoutly Latin, and she's the one who encouraged him to become a Latin as well. Now, this is a very important turning point. I would make the argument that if Clovis had not converted to Latin Christianity, instead of converted to Arian Christianity, modern Christianity today would look very, very different. But this one individual converting to Latin Christianity, and not only that, let me make the point that upon his conversion to Latin Christianity, Clovis also becomes the protector of Rome. Now, the city of Rome at the time had been under constant attack by a group of Germanic peoples known as the Lombards, who had made their home here in northern Italy. Now, Jackie, I see your question. I'll get to you, I promise. So, again, the Lombards had been constantly harassing the city of Rome and the bishop, and so Clovis becomes its protector and pretty much begins a crusade, or begins a war against the Lombards to pretty much ensure the safety of Rome. And so it's kind of a symbiotic relationship between the Bishop of Rome and Clovis, where the Bishop of Rome kind of is the one who coronates, who not only baptizes Clovis, but crowns him as the true king. Right. In addition, so not only does it give Clovis more legitimacy and more prestige, it also Clovis in return protects the Bishop of Rome. All right, and so you pretty much have, again, a pretty profound sense of change here within Christianity, within Rome. Now, to answer your question, Jacqueline, keep in mind that paganism, the word pagan or paganism, is a catch-all term. It pretty much, historians and others pretty much use it to describe non-Christian local religions during this period in time. So in other words, I can't really tell you, what a pagan is, because it depends on their local regions, the local gods. For example, the Scandinavian religion, like Thor and Odin, et cetera, technically could be considered a pagan religion. Right, but then even today, you have people who claim to be pagan who, again, engage in, what, for lack of a better phrase, nature worship. Sometimes they do. For the most part, they're non-monotheistic. But again, the gods or the spirits or the deities that they believe in changes from person to person. Now, and we'll actually talk about this concept of paganism in just a bit towards the end of this particular lecture series. Now, despite Clovis establishing this pretty strong foundation for the Kingdom of the Franks, you do have, and you do have the Kingdom of Franks, kind of increasing in size. It nonetheless suffers from a particular problem, and this problem is called partible inheritance. In other words, what this means is, let's say, for example, you have a large piece of land that a farmer owns, and it's a very large, very prosperous land, and this farmer has 3 sons. Now, I make this sons very specific because, remember, inheritance laws at this time only apply to men. And so what happens is, let's say this farmer passes away, and his 3 sons will carve up this large piece of land between themselves, all right, as equal as possible. Now, eventually, however, let's say that these 3 sons have children of their own. So when they pass, that land gets carved up even more. And so this partible partible inheritance, it's a equitable way to ensure the inheritance of the land to all the surviving sons. But the problem is that the land gets smaller and smaller. Now, this isn't just about real estate. This is also about kingdoms. In this case, Clovis, when he dies, is eventually his kingdom passes to his sons, which again carve up the kingdom for themselves, which make establishing a solid state impossible. Because every time a monarch dies, that land passes to how many sons that person had. All right, so again, despite the fact that the Merovingians, again, themselves were relatively successful rulers, they themselves, again, are victims of this particular tradition. Now, towards the end of Merovingian France, this period that we call it now, there is a new family rising known as the Carolingians. Now, the founder of this, this family has been around for a while, but kind of the founder of this kind of golden era of this family is Charles. Now, Charles is not a king. He's actually the mayor of the city of Paris. And he becomes famous and kind of gains notoriety in 731 CE. Now, just again, a reminder, so what happens in 20 years before, in 711 CE, the Moors, also known as the Moros in Spanish, invade the Iberian Peninsula, what is now Portugal and Spain. Now, keep in mind that the Moors are a particular ethnic group in what is now Northern Africa. They convert to Islam and on their own decide to, again, conquer the Iberian Peninsula from the Visigoths. So they overrun the majority of Spain and Portugal, and eventually they send their armies northwards to try to conquer what is now France. In 731, Charles and his army meet this Moorish army and eventually win this major battle, the Battle of Tours. Now, this is actually a profoundly important period in European history. There's a lot of, there's a lot of people who play kind of what if In other words, with historical events like what if the South had won the Civil War? What if, you know, Kennedy had never been assassinated? In this case, there's a big what if community about um, what if the Moors had won the Battle of Tours? Would the entirety of Europe have converted to Islam? We really don't know. And it's kind of dangerous to play that game because you get very conspiratorial. And so, nevertheless, it's very interesting. So again, Charles, because of his victory against the Moors at the Battle of Tours, eventually kind of gains his notoriety. As a matter of fact, he gets a new nickname for himself, Charles Martel. Martel is the French word for hammer, like martillo in Spanish, martel. So eventually, the Merovingian line comes to an end, and his son, Pepin the Short, and yes, this is a period in time in history where you begin to see different really creative names to differentiate between rulers. There's Pepin the Short, there's Charles the Bald, there's Charles the Fat. They're very creative. Pepin the Short, Charles' son, eventually becomes king of the Franks. Now, it is during Pepin's reign, when he becomes king of the Franks, that you see an actual tradition of coronation. Now, the word coronation refers to the actual crowning of the king. In this case, you have a whole ceremony of just the actual process of putting on the crown on the new king. Now, so what this means is that upon Pepin the Short's crowning, you essentially have the Pope essentially placing the crown on the head of Pepin, establishing a new alliance. Now, not only that, the Pope also introduces the ceremony of unction. Now, what this means is, again, the actual process of having a mass and crowning him in the name of God. Now, this is a very important ceremony, or a very important part of the ceremony, because again, not only does it establish the alliance between the kingdom of the Franks and the Pope, but it also establishes that this ruler is ordained by God. Which, remember, this is an incredibly important sense of legitimacy for rulers from Europe to the Middle East to now China, where you have rulers essentially using the justification of faith to rule. Now, so we should probably start talking about what the medieval church looks at this point in time. And as we do, it's important that we kind of get off, or at least start off, by introducing the separation between what is known as a secular and regular clergy. The secular clergy are those priests priests, bishops, church officials who kind of have a parish, and that's who they are. The regular clergy are actually considered to be monasteries, monks, missionaries, etc., etc. So there's a difference between the secular clergy, which is, again, your average priest or your bishop, and then the regular clergy who live in monasteries, who are monks, not necessarily actual clergy. So there is a difference between the two. Now, let's talk about the development of Christian monasticism. In other words, the development of orders like the Franciscans, the Jesuits. Now, they'll come later, but they kind of have their origins here early on. Now, when Christian missionaries began traveling eastward, when they began traveling into what is now Iran, and eventually India, they come into contact with Buddhist and Hindu monasteries. And they are incredibly impressed by the discipline, the devotion, the overall, kind of appeal of asceticism. Remember, Christianity in many ways preaches asceticism, preaches the idea of letting go of material concepts. And so many Christians began borrowing bits and pieces of Buddhist and Hindu monasticism and began bringing it back into Europe. And so you begin to see Christians, again, who begin practicing this asceticism, and much like in Buddhism, they begin living together, where they pray, they work, they maintain themselves, and they try to offer, or again, increase their religious studies. But the thing about it is that there's no regulation. In other words, every monastery is different from each other. One monastery will emphasize one thing, another monastery will emphasize another. Now, this changes, however, with Benedict. Now, Benedict is a Christian hermit. Remember, a hermit is an individual who kind of lives out on his own. He is a hermit that lives in a cave on a mountaintop here in central Italy. Now, the story goes is that he's very well respected. He's respected for his piety, his faith. He performs miracles, etc., etc. But he lives by himself. Now, there's a nearby monastery who wants to basically have him as their leader. So they go to him and they say, "Can you please teach us how to live like you?" Now, according to tradition, Benedict at first says no, but then he gets a message from God saying, yeah, go ahead. Well, the thing about it is that Benedict's life is incredibly difficult. It's a lot of prayer, a lot of work. It's not a lot of conversation. Very strict asceticism. It's incredibly strict. So strict, however, so strict, in fact, that the monks in that monastery, which asked him to be, their leader, they did plot to kill him. Now, eventually, he gets wind of this and goes back to his cave in central Italy. Now, a few years later, another group of monks come by and say, "Hey, can you please lead us? And we promise not to kill you." And so eventually, after a lot of prayer, a lot of thought, Benedict tries again, and this time it works. He establishes a set of rules for these monasteries, and this is the foundation of monastic life during this period in time. And so, again, the Benedictine monasteries, they emphasize this thing of praying, of work. It's incredibly, again, aesthetic, but nonetheless, this becomes the foundation of Christian monastic life from this point on. Now, it's important to note that monasteries are not just places where people go to pray and that's it. They, in many ways, after the collapse of Western Rome, they become kind of the center of life and economic life in Europe, because eventually these monasteries begin serving as sources of employment. The monasteries oftentimes own a lot of land that people donate to, as kind of a gift. And so these lands begin to be used to raise cattle or to grow food or other things like this. And so many people begin working for the monasteries, right, as a sense of employment. Many local rulers, not wanting to spend on the bureaucracy, will actually employ the monasteries to collect taxes for them. Many of them have breweries where they brew beer, or they make wine, or they produce bread. And so these monasteries become kind of the local engine of the economy. Now, aside from this, they also begin to be emphasized as education centers of education. Now, these are not universities or institutions of higher learning by any means. Now, what this means instead is that they emphasize on some limited education, which is here. If you see the particular two emphasis on education, what are known as the several liberal arts, trivium, which is emphasis in grammar, rhetoric, and logic, and quadrivium, which is arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. And so many of these monasteries begin the process of actually kind of teaching what are considered to be the basic, fundamentals of education. Rhetoric is a type of, think of it like a philosophy. It's like taking a philosophy class. Now, obviously, at the head of the Latin Church, which later becomes the Catholic Church, is the Bishop of Rome. Now, the Bishop of Rome, the actual office of the Bishop of Rome, has been in place since the origin of Christianity. Ever since Peter became the first Bishop of Rome, Peter, that of one of the first 12 apostles, becomes Bishop of Rome a few years after the death of Jesus. And so the Bishop of Rome has always kind of more or less existed, but you begin to see a new role being implemented with the rise of Gregory. And Gregory the First is probably the most important pope in history. Now, clearly needless to say, there are quite a number of popes between Peter and this current Pope Francis, but nevertheless, Gregory may have been the most important because he establishes the concept of the Bishop of Rome being the spiritual head of the Christian Church of Western Europe. He really does begin to kind of, remember, keep in mind that at this point in time, before Gregory, the Bishop of Rome has always been kind of subservient to the Byzantine Emperor. Remember, the Byzantine Emperor, the Basilius of Constantinople, is still considered to be the head of Christianity. During Gregory's time, however, you begin to see more and more of a separation, where all of a sudden now Gregory is now seen as the true spiritual head of the church in Western Europe. And so not only that, but you also begin to see this encouragement of what we call religious syncretism, which we've already talked in this class already about before, but just to kind of reiterate, if you remember, I was telling you about how what begins happening during this period of time is in order to make you begin to see Christian missionaries travel to different parts of not just Europe, but Central Asia, Africa, other parts. And you begin to see that missionaries kind of taking bits and pieces of local customs, religious customs and concepts, and including it into the religion. For example, this is where you begin to see the inclusion of pagan symbols like the Easter bunny, the rabbits and eggs, and including them into Easter. Same thing with Christmas, where all of a sudden you see this emphasis on this saint, Nicholas, who actually was originally a pagan deity, and all of a sudden he becomes a this Christian saint, and the concept of the Christmas tree also comes into play as well. So you begin to see this process of conversion. Now remember, the whole purpose of religious syncretism is to try to ease the transition from being non-Christian to being Christian. And for the most part, it is a relatively successful means of encouraging conversion Christianity. Because again, remember, if you just go from one religion to a totally foreign and unknown one, it's quite the transition, and many people just won't go for it. But if you include bits and pieces of a religion that they're familiar with, they're more willing to kind of convert. So this religious syncretism will remain a very important part of Christian conversion and missionary efforts well into the 17th, 18th century. So eventually, one of the descendants of Charles Martel and Pepin the Short, Charlemagne, will eventually become king of the Franks. Now, Charles, now the word Charlemagne actually literally means Charles the Great. His real name was actually Charles. He becomes the king of the Franks in 768, and eventually he will eventually kind of expand using war and diplomacy. Will expand the borders of the Frankish kingdom to include much of what is now Western and Southern Germany, much of Italy, parts of Spain. He, in many ways, unites a significant portion of the old Roman Empire together for the first time since it collapsed. And so the rise of Charlemagne really does symbolize kind of the blending of Germanic and Christian and Roman pieces to create this new empire, right, led by him. Now, he built a new capital in the city of Aachen. Now, Aachen, if you can follow my little pointer here, is located here in what is now kind of more or less the border between, the border between Germany and France. Now, despite the fact that he has his capital, he rarely actually uses it. For much of his reign, Charlemagne actually travels throughout the empire, making sure that things are running in order. Now, in order to simplify, or at least in order to kind of give, to administer his empire, he pretty much carves out his empire into various small little bits and pieces, which are known as counties, and each county is governed by a noble known as a count. This is where the word county comes from. So again, in order to administer his empire more effectively, Charlemagne, again, divides his empire into counties, with each of these counties being governed by a count, a noble. Now, in addition to, again, trying to create this large administering empire, he also kind of reestablishes a legal system. He establishes his own currency. He even begins the process of actually trying to revive education, learning. And he does this by appointing his old teacher, Alcuin of York, York being a city in what is now England, to pretty much begin the process of establishing schools. And so, not only do you see this attempt to revive education, you also begin to see the encouragement of writing books. Remember, printing is still a ways away, and so you do begin to see the process of actually trying to not only write new works, but many of Alcuin's work was dedicated to preserving Greek and Latin texts, right? So that they don't get lost. And so again, you do have this attempt to try to reestablish this kind of intellectual heritage left behind by the Romans. Now, again, in 800 CE, Charlemagne becomes Emperor of the Romans. Now, this is a title given to him by the Bishop of Rome, of the Pope. Now, if y'all remember from last week's conversation, why would this be problematic? Why would naming Charlemagne be problematic for a particular someone? Anyone remember? Very good. Remember, the Basilius, the Byzantine emperor, is still technically is still the Roman emperor. Remember that's never changed. And so all of a sudden, the Bishop of Rome crowns this barbarian, for lack of a better phrase, as emperor of the Romans. This really didn't sit well with the Basilius. But remember, the Bishop of Rome's justification is if this thing, the donation of Constantine. Remember, this was this fraudulent document that claimed that the Bishop of Rome had the authority to appoint a new emperor. Remember, it was a forgery. It's a fraud. Nevertheless, this was the justification. So all of a sudden now you have the attempt to recreate the Roman Empire, and as an exchange for this, Charlemagne again becomes being the devout Latin Christian that he is. He begins the process of sending out missionaries throughout what is now Scandinavia and northern Germany in the Baltic area, here above what is now Germany. Now, many of these conversions essentially Charlemagne sent basically two armies. The first army were missionaries. Missionaries sent out to convert the people willingly, and if they didn't, he also sent out a real army. In other words, if you don't convert, these guys are going to kill you. So again, you do begin to see the process of spreading Christianity through the sword in what is now Northern Europe. Now, Um, After Charlemagne's death, his son Louis the Pious becomes king, and for the most part, Louis does a pretty good job of administering his father's empire. But the problem becomes that after Louis's death in 840 CE, his three sons begin fighting over who becomes the next Roman emperor. And after a brief civil war and a lot of negotiation, the Treaty of Verdun in 843 basically divides Charlemagne's empire into three sections, and pretty much ends the glory of this Frankish kingdom. From this point on, Europe once again begins to fracture. Now, this is where things get really dark for Europe at this period in time. Not only do you see the dissolving of this Frankish empire, you also begin to see the rise of new threats from outside Europe that destabilize Europe and do everything from decrease birth rates to disrupt food production, et cetera, et cetera. The first thing is the rise of the Vikings. Now, the Vikings themselves, is important to note that that Vikings is often used as a catch-all term for everyone who lives in what is now Denmark, Norway, Sweden, et cetera, et cetera. But keep in mind, the word Viking actually refers to the warriors, the actual soldiers themselves. Now, this area of Europe, what is now, again, Scandinavia, which is now Denmark, Sweden, Norway, these areas have been kind of ignored by many in history at this point in time before the rise of the Vikings, simply because there wasn't a lot going on. You basically have Scandinavia being divided into various tribes and clans, and they pretty much keep to themselves. Yes, they do stuff, but for the most part, they're much like the eras before Muhammad. No one really notices them. Now, around 800, things begin to change, and a lot of this has to do with population. The globe at this point in time is getting warmer, which means that more food is being produced, which means that populations begin to increase. And in this case, in Scandinavia, the population increases to the point that the local ecosystem cannot sustain that number of humanity. And so you begin to see them, not only do you begin to see them spread out to find more land to farm, et cetera, but you also begin to see certain chiefs defeating rival chiefs and eventually becoming kings. With this internal stability, with clans no longer fighting each other, and you begin to see them coalescing, in other words, begin uniting, you begin to see them turn their attention to the wealthier lands of what is now England and Western Europe. In many situations, many monasteries and nunneries and churches were built along the coast and were practically defenseless. And so the Vikings become, infamous, I should say, for pretty much attacking monasteries and churches, and not only basically stealing everything that isn't nailed down, but also have them, especially with nunneries, taking the nuns and basically raping them, and in cases of monasteries, basically enslaving all the monks in there. Now, this obviously, needless to say, seems is harsh, and it is, but look at the eyes of the Vikings. Now, keep in mind that if it's like if someone leaving a $50 bill, outside with no one to claim it. It's like basically they want us to steal their stuff. So the Vikings become more and more problematic during this period of time, especially on the coasts of, again, like I mentioned before, what is now France, Holland. Very good. Yeah, it's pretty much like, it's your fault for, leaving the stuff out. In England. Now, aside from that, you also begin to see the rise of, again, Muslim pirates as well, particularly from North Africa. North African pirates begin attacking and raiding the coast of what is now Spain, well, not Spain, but France, Italy, et cetera, making trade incredibly difficult along the Mediterranean. At the same time, you also have the arrival of the Magyars. Now, the Magyars are another one of these pastoral peoples who come from the steppes of southern Russia, Central Asia. They arrive in Europe and immediately cause a major panic. Now, eventually, the Germanic princes, the nobles of Germany are able to unite together and defeat the Magyars, but for quite some time they cause a lot of disruption. In all three of these, the Vikings, Muslim pirates, and the Magyars eventually caused major economic disruptions in Europe during the ninth and 10th centuries. Now, with the collapse of Charlemagne's empire, you begin to see a new era of European history, which will exist probably until the end of the 1300s, which is known as feudalism. Now, feudalism, I'm sure all of you have heard of it. This is the period in time of nobles and castles. It is not as romanticized as movies and TV shows make it out to be. Now, feudalism, it's a very difficult term to describe because every historian has a different interpretation of what it is. But the interpretation that I have that is the simplest one possible that I will ask you to remember is the idea that there are three kind of sections of society. You have the nobility. You have the monarchy. I'm sorry, Jonathan, I was looking at you, the pirates there. I think you're referring to the ones in Somalia. Yeah, I mean, piracy is still a thing, and particularly in places in what is now Somalia, Ethiopia, and even places in Southeast Asia, you still have piracy. So you have the monarchy, you have the nobility, and then you have the peasantry. It's important to note that in feudalism, you basically have one serving the other. The monarch needs the nobility to rule, but the nobility provide the monarchy with soldiers and money. So the monarch, again, at the same time, while he's technically the ruler, depends on the nobility to rule. And the peasantry, they provide food and services. Yeah, and it's a very patronage system. Now, in this particular system, normally the monarch is obviously considered to be the supreme power. Remember, technically they are ordained by God, but truly, power lies in the hands of the nobility. The nobility control the peasantry because remember, the nobility lives on the lands that the peasants also happen to live on. All right, but you also have them working for the noble. I'll explain in just a minute. The nobility also controls the monarchy because they send tax money to the monarch and they also provide soldiers. Well, if they want to. So again, at the bottom line, what I need you to remember is that in feudalism, it is the nobility that controls power in a system like this. Okay. Now, so the nobles, there's various titles and there's various, hierarchy for them because you have dukes, you have counts, you have marquises, you have even bishops, and many are also considered to be nobles. You have barons, you have earls. So you have all these different types of nobles, right? And it varies from era to era, region to region, et cetera. But all of these really are the ones who control the land. Earls are a type of local landlord. Think of it. It's used specifically in England. The word earl comes from the Scandinavian word jarl, and yeah, so you have dukes, duchesses, counts, countesses, marquises. There's no female version of bishops, baroness, and earlness. So the word earl comes from the Scandinavian word jarl, and it just means a local lord. So all of these different types of nobles control a particular piece of land. If you notice here, this map here is a good little map of what a typical manor is. Now, at the center of this manor is, of course, the house of the Lord. Now, these manors also provide different types of economic output as well. For example, If you see here, you have everything from a bakery to a mill to a blacksmith. You might have like an orchard that produces, depending on what region you are, it produces hops for beer, grapes for wine. And so you have this whole self-sustaining economy here. Because remember, keep in mind that long distance trade, trade between, let's say, for example, anything from, Europe, trade between Europe and China is pretty much done. It happens sparingly. Everyone, very, very rarely. But even trade from, say, from one particular region in France to another one, it doesn't really happen anymore, or at least it's a very rare concept. So you begin to see many self-sustaining processes here. Now, if you notice here, these areas in green and in red are the fields that are used to produce food. But if you notice here, you have a differentiation between the common fields, which are basically the fields that the workers use to feed themselves, and the fields cultivated for the Lord. These are fields that are specifically for the Lord, and the Lord pretty much, this is all the stuff that the Lord keeps and either sells or stores. And so needless to say, you see here this particular thing. Now, one of the things that I forgot to mention, or at least haven't mentioned to this point, is the issue of knights. I'm sure all of you are familiar with the concept of knights, et cetera, et cetera. Well, it's important to note that the concept of knighthood is very romanticized in TV movies, in case you haven't figured it out yet. So just to give you a brief kind of overview, knights, for the most part, are the youngest sons of a noble. Now, if you all remember, eventually what happens over this time is people begin to realize, if you all remember from the previous lecture about partible influence or partible inheritance, where you have land being distributed equally between sons, people begin to catch on that, yeah, maybe this isn't the best way to kind of go about things. So instead, you begin to see the adoption of what is known as primogenitura. Primogenitura is basically the firstborn. In other words, the oldest son, surviving son, and I use the word son specifically, the oldest surviving son inherits everything, everything. So what this means is that the youngest sons in this era of primogenitura don't get anything. They might get some sort of, package, some sort of, I guess, inheritance, but nothing compared to the oldest son. And so from the time that the youngest sons are born, they are pretty much trained to go out on their own and look for their own fortune. Now, what this means is they are trained in hand-to-hand combat. They're trained in basic, education like arithmetic and rhetoric, et cetera, et cetera. And the hope is when they turn a certain age, they will go out and offer themselves out for hire. As what are known as vassals. This is the technical term for a knight. Now, what this means is, yes, they serve as warriors, but they also serve as basically the right hand person for whatever noble they're dealing with. So not only do they fight for him, they also oversee the fields. They also ensure that the blacksmith is producing. So they're pretty much the managers of this property that the noble owns. So it's a lot more complicated than simply warriors. Now, in exchange for service, once a vassal is contracted by a noble, you have them basically serving in exchange for a piece of land. This piece of land is known as a fief. You see here, this fief is basically the land that the noble gives the knight or the knight vassal, you want to call it, in exchange for service. Does that make sense, more or less? So this is what knights look for. This is what the goal is. Remember, they're the younger sons of nobles left out of inheritance, so they are trained from a very young age in everything from accounting to warfare, and eventually go out and try to get themselves contracted out to a local lord in exchange for a piece of land. Very good, Jonathan. Yes. So this is why I said in the beginning, the oldest surviving son. So if the oldest surviving son dies, which again tends to happen, it will go to the next son. All right. So continuing forward, um, what I want to do today, well, because there's really no knighthood after that. So, well, I mean, even let's say, for example, that this guy, this individual eventually goes out, gets hired by a noble, and he gets word that his oldest brother died. Then he can pretty much just leave and say, you know what, I'm about to inherit this land from my father. It's been nice, but I got to go. So you're not bound permanently to this particular lord. Now, um, after so discussing the kind of the greater sense of politics here, after the collapse of the Carolingian dynasty in France, or at least what is now France, you see a crisis here because the last Carolingian ruler dies without an heir. So the nobles of France, the nobles of France get together and decide that the only solution would be to find a noble among them to pretty much rise to the position of king. And so they kind of get together and decide that the best solution possible is one of the local lesser lords, Hugh Capet. Now, Hugh is a pretty capable guy, but the reason why the nobles pick him is because they think he's a pushover. In other words, that he'll just do what they say and that's it. So they name Hugh king, and he establishes a new dynasty, which technically will rule France until 1793, when the last Capetian ruler, or at least the last ruler that can trace his heritage back to Hugh, Louis the 15th, will be beheaded, guillotined by French revolutionaries. So it's a pretty successful dynasty considering it lasted 800 years. So, nevertheless, Hugh Capet actually turns out to be a pretty uh, uh, capable ruler. Right? Not only does he kind of establish his own independence away from the nobles, but increases the size of France and turns it into it. Now, again, it's not to say that he is this all-powerful monarch, but he does he does have a good working relationship, and he establishes his own independence away from the nobility. In addition, he also increases his own lands, which again are known as the demes. Now, this word here, Demesne, this basically refers in the feudal system. This refers to the lands that are directly ruled by the king. So in many areas of practice feudalism, yes, much of the land is being held by the nobility, but you also have particular lands that are being held by the monarch himself, right? And so in this case, you have a pretty substantial size of a domain here in France, led by Hugh Capet. Now, again, over the next 300 years, you have these Capetian kings, his dynasty continuing to extend royal control over France. Now, eventually, you eventually have Louis, I mean, I'm sorry, not Louis, Philip IV, essentially establishing um, pretty much a new system of government that doesn't necessarily take power away from the hands of the nobility, but it gives more power to local administrative, or at least basically a common sense of, or a general sense of of community. Now, what I mean by this is he establishes something known as the Estates General, which I will spell here. The Estates General is basically a assembly. It's think of it kind of like a Congress, but not really. This is the best way I can describe it. So the States General begins serving as an advisory board to the king. They begin advising them, but over time they begin to get power. Now, before I talk about the power that the States General has, it's important to note what it's made up of. In France, you have society being divided into three specific estates. So it's basically, so the easiest way to describe it, or is those who pray, no, see, those who fight, oh, those who pray, so what I mean by this, what I mean by those who pray, needless to say, are the clergy. The clergy is the first estate. Now, this includes everything from the local parish priest in the middle of nowhere to the Archbishop of Paris. Right. Next are those who fight, the nobility. Remember, technically speaking, the nobles, one of their big things that they have to do is provide armies for the King of France. So in this case, the nobility, the second estate, are those who fight. The third estate is everyone else. If you're not a clergyman, if you're not a noble, you are in the third estate. Now, it's important to note that the States General, this assembly made up by members of each three of these estates, they're not equal representation. In other words, the first and second estates dominate the number of seats in this assembly. The third estate gets very little representation. Now, as I mentioned before, originally the States General began to serve as an advisory board, but eventually they begin to have the power to actually raise, lower, or create new taxes. And so, technically speaking, the King of France cannot raise or create new taxes without the consent of the Estates General. Now, as time increases, as time passes, you'll begin to see more and more influence by the Estates General. But eventually, at some point in time, in the early 1600s, you essentially have the King of France pretty much refusing to call the Estates General, and that becomes the kind of model for much of the kings going forward. In other words, basically not calling the Estates General and basing their entire revenue, or much of it, I should say, on loans, which, needless to say, is a very bad idea. It's not until the next, so between 1615 and 1790, there are no Estates General called at all. And the only reason why the Estates General is called in 1790 is because France is completely and utterly bankrupt. So yeah, no choice. But again, I'm obviously getting ahead of myself. Now, in England, so in England, there's a particular period in time here that becomes incredibly complicated. If you notice on this map here, England is not really a thing. Yes, you do have the Kingdom of England, but for the most part, you have it divided between various little tribes, clans. This map here actually shows it a little bit more complicated. You see here, there's various different little kingdoms, each with its own laws, et cetera, et cetera. Now, for a brief period in time, around 950, England is actually briefly united under their first king, Alfred. Alfred unites the kingdom together, but then he dies and it goes back to the way it was. It doesn't also help that the Vikings are constantly attacking and actually for a while actually conquer England itself. Now, eventually, however, you do have England once again being reunited under a king, and eventually his son, Harold, becomes the next king of England. Now, across the Atlantic Channel, the English Channel, I should say, across the English Channel here in northern France, there's a particular area in northern France called Normandy. Now, this region here, which I'm going to point out in this map here, this region here in northern France, was at one point in time not only invaded by the Vikings, but they stayed. And they worked out a deal with the King of France. Basically, that they can keep this land that they settled on the condition that they stop raiding. In other words, stop doing the things that you're doing, and you can keep this land that you settled on. And so, for the most part, the Vikings agreed and settled in Normandy, where they became Normans. Technically, they're part of the Kingdom of France, but we're not going to really get into the specifics of that because it's very complicated. Now, the ruler of Normandy is the Duke of Normandy, William. Now, technically, William and Harold are brothers. But nevertheless, you do have William being left out of the throne, which he believes is rightly his. And so you have him actually leading an invasion of England to gain his throne back. And he meets technically his half-brother, Harold, on the battlefield at the Battle of Hastings in 1066 CE. Now, very interesting, Battle of Hastings is one of the more famous battles in world history, particularly specifically in European history. And it wasn't all that epic, because quite frankly, within the first 5 minutes of the battle, the king Harold took an arrow to the eye and died. So pretty much battle ended right there and then. Nevertheless, Hastings establishes William as the new king of England. And this establishes kind of the succession of England being ruled by William and eventually further down the line. Now, William and his successors begin the process of actually kind of stabilizing and reorganizing England into a legitimate kingdom here. Now, again, for the first, eventually one of his descendants-ish, Henry, establishes kind of rewrites the law system, establishes the common law system. Now, what I will say is this, that the common law system, actually, it is the foundation of our current law system even to this day. Now, what this means is that before this common law system was created, every baron and noble in England had their own law code. And it was very complicated. They had their own court system. It just made things a mess. And so Henry decides to pretty much get rid of all of that, and instead pretty much establish a common law system that pretty much stretches from every border of England. Now, in addition, he also began establishing the use of royal writs. Now, what a writ is a written, it's technically a written order issued by a court commanding the party who is addressed to perform or cease performing a specified act. Henry began the process of using these writs to pretty much enforce his demands. Now, these writs, he can't pretty much do whatever he wants, but at the same time, they are legally binding. And so this power of the king to write writs increases his own authority in this very, very divided land. Because again, remember, you still have these fights against the nobles, particularly the barons. Now, a baron, again, is a type of noble that is found in England. And these, you begin to see clashes between the monarchy, in this case Henry, and the barons, the noble. Now, eventually, this battle between the barons and the monarchy will kind of fall on the brink of civil war, especially with the rise of John. John, who is the son of Henry, becomes king in 1199. He does not have the power or the charisma that his father had. And eventually he's bullied into signing this document known as the Magna Carta, pretty much granting nobles unalienable specific rights. Now, it's important to note, I see this a lot, and it kind of does bother me where people point to this Magna Carta and say this is the beginnings of the origins of what will become the American Constitution. Kind of, but not really. What I mean by this is that, yes, while it does establish written rights on paper, keep in mind that these rights are only specifically for the nobility. Everyone else is pretty much left out. Because remember, the nobles don't care about anyone else. They care about their own rights. So the Magna Carta essentially established rights on the process of having the nobles pretty much having rights that the monarchy cannot take away from the nobles. Now, it's not to say that the commoners are left out. It's not. For example, you do have this establishment of, say, for example, the right to a trial by jury, the issue of taxation. but nonetheless, this is a power grab by the nobles. Now, eventually, you also have the monarch also agreeing to the creation of what are known as and I'll spell it out here, privy councils. These are councils that advise the king on everything from taxation to war. And eventually, however, as these privy councils increase in membership, you begin to see this form the foundation of what later become the parliament. Now, parliament is essentially the English version of the Estates General. Eventually, much like the Estates General, the monarch of England cannot create or raise or not create or raise new taxes without the consent of this particular parliament. Now, eventually, this parliament model is refined during the reign of Edward in 1272, where he creates what is known as a bicameral parliament. Remember, the word bicameral means there's two specific chambers. In this case, there is the House of Lords, which is again made up by the nobility, and the House of Commons, which, despite what it sounds like, not anyone can be elected to the House of Commons. More than anything else, it's landowners. So again, in order to participate in this parliamentary system, one has to be a landlord, or not a landlord, but a landowner specifically. All right, so we have unfortunately run out of time. So let me see here. Forgive me while I. Okay, so again, we have run out of time, but nonetheless, I just want to remind you that on Tuesday we'll finish up here with chapter 11 and start with chapter 12, and also just a reminder that the deadlines for the research paper and the PSAs are coming up. I lost the deadlines at the top of my head, but you can find them on the syllabus. So just please be aware of that. I do have office hours coming up in a few minutes, so if you need to talk to me, just please, come and see me on Blackboard. Just FYI, I have a conference call at 11 o'clock, so my office hours only run from 10 to 11 today. I apologize, but it is what it is. But nonetheless, if there's not anything else, I will see you all next Tuesday. Have a good weekend. Stay safe, and I will post up the recorded lecture here later on today, if not tomorrow. So other than that, yeah, like I said, if you need to please meet with me, please see me on Blackboard, on Blackboard Collaborate. Other than that, have a good rest of the day.